sack, the Irish peasantry and the class struggle, which I think is to do with a book, Mark's book. Thank you, Mark. Carry on.
Thank you, Stan. It is. I think any self-respecting communist is going to recognize where that quote comes from, potatoes in a sack. And I think I do address it, though perhaps indirectly in my prepared remarks. But the answer should come out. And thank you very much for inviting me along to give this talk, which is the first talk I've given broadly on the theme of the book since it came out. It's not been out very long. I'm going to see if I can just share um, my presentation here. So let's go and sharing time. So I think I've sent a request to turn on sharing. Do something.
I have allowed it, so hopefully.
Can that be seen? Can people see?
It will take a short time. I have allowed you to do it. So
Let's see. I need to press something else. It will not matter terribly. Okay.
That's it,
yeah,
Mark Mulholland.
yeah,
Started
we can
sharing.
see it now.
Nice, that, okay. So anyway, the title of the talk, and it's relating to this book, which just came out a few weeks ago, and is right now crawling its way to shops, one hopes, though it remains to be seen, I suppose. To some extent, the theme of it, in an odd way, is represented by this cover, which is a rather joyful looking peasant pair. This guy waving his stick or his shillelagh about and waving it up defiantly. This tends not to be the way the Irish peasantry has been presented. It's much more likely to be, as you can see on the side there, a classic book on the Irish famine, The Great Hunger, and that shows a kind of characteristically doleful looking peasant pair, looking very unhappy, as you might imagine. I'm sure they mostly did during the famine. Or the other presentation, the famine, as in this book underneath, views of the Irish peasantry, where we can see a peasant looking very angry, somewhat out of control, certainly looking violent, and crashing down with his stick on a hapless victim, the idea of haplessly striking down on an inferior. This tends to be how the Irish peasantry has been presented in the historical literature, and the historical literature has been voluminous and genuinely impressive. I could pick any number of books. I'm going to just pick Why Ireland Starved by Joel Mocker, if for no other reason that Joel Mocker last week won the Nobel Prize in Economics. So really serious historical scholarship has been brought to bear on the Irish peasantry and its travails. And it's something which attracts, at least in Ireland, a good deal of interest. This Atlas of the Great Irish Famine is both a scholarly work, a lavishly illustrated work, unlike my own, and a coffee table book. I think it did grace a lot of Irish tables a few Christmases ago as a nice Christmas present. So it has got attention, but the Irish peasantry has been, in these books, depicted in a particular way, which I want to talk about now. I don't make a big deal about it in the book, but I think it's not unreasonable to say that a certain Marxist framing has been directed my research and directed my writing in this. But I hasten to add that this is certainly not the first time Marxism or a version of it has been used to look at the Irish peasantry. The Irish peasantry has been submitted to what you might call modern scholarship since the late 1960s at any rate. And it has posed itself very self-consciously as revisionist, and those who know anything about Irish historiography would know the resonance of the term revisionism. Revisionism sees itself as overthrowing nationalist pieties. The applicable nationalist piety in this case is supposed to be the oppressed heroic peasantry and the evil exploiting landlord elite. Revisionism, therefore, implies that the Irish peasantry are not so oppressed, that they weren't a defiant, unified collectivity struggling against the landlords, and the landlords, poor dears, were rather misunderstood and nowhere near as beastly as they were presented. I think revisionists, as is often the case, have rather struggled to find their whipping boy or their placeholder for traditionalism. The book which is usually cited for nationalist piety, which has to be got rid of, is John Pomfret's The Struggle for Land in Ireland, published by that notorious purveyor of Republican subversion, Princeton University Press, in 1930. Pomfret, as far as I know, had no Irish connections at all. His speciality, he was from New England, and his speciality was colonial America. This book he wrote on Irish land question seems to be a complete outlier in his career. The book nonetheless presents an ongoing, consistent struggle of the peasantry against the landed elite, which is more or less victorious, and the landed elite burnishes its reputation to no great degree in his analysis. I think it's a very good book, Pomfret's book, and I recommend anyone to read it today, actually. And it's not a nationalist rant. No reason it should be. There is a certain paradox about Irish history, that a great deal of what is often determined to be crude nationalist propaganda is no such thing in any obvious way. So, for example, Pomfret has a bibliography where he talks about interesting books people might like to read. One of them is G. Locher Lampson, A Consideration of the State of Ireland in the 19th Century. He says, a huge work containing a mass of material, intensely anti-English. The appendices contain many useful documents. I agree with all of that. It's very useful. It's very entertaining. It's intensely anti-landlord, intensely critical of the English government. What it doesn't say is that Locher Lampson, when he wrote this book, was a Tory MP and a unionist. The reality was it was quite difficult to look at the Irish land question, or indeed Irish history in this period at all, and pat oneself on the back if one is representative of the British ruling class. Now, I mentioned as a kind of historical revisionism from the 1960s. It kind of begins with a book with the unenticing name Irish Agricultural Production, its volume and structure, by this bloke himself, a kind of a farmer, Raymond Crotty, who educates himself into academia. Throughout his long career, he's a land nationalizer in the Henry George tradition, and a vehement opponent of the European Economic Community, Ireland joining the EEC. So he's a radical, but one which radicals, at least since radicalism became rather blushingly attached to the European project, Crotty's never been in much favour. But the book is a book of eccentric genius in many respects, and well worth reading still, if you can get your hands on it, which is not easy. He essentially presents the pre-famine Irish peasantry as a proletariat in the original sense of the term, in the sense of the Roman sense of the proletariat, in that all the proletarian has is the ability to have children. That's the only property they have, is their children. Crotty says that the peasantry before Ireland, because they have any surplus they may produce, seized off them in rent. Their land they possess is of no value to them above bare subsistence. The only thing they can really do is have lots of children and divide up the land between them. So you have a progenitive peasant society. They have lots and lots of kids, and this meets its nemesis with the famine, a Malthusian catastrophe where 1 million people die. After the famine, he says, the peasantry restructures. From the 1970s, you get more and more scholars looking into the Irish land question, particularly in the decade up to 1881, because 1881 was the 1979 to 81 was the 100th centenary of the Irish Land War, so there's a lot of material publication leading up to that. And academics quite frequently used a kind of Marxism when they were looking at this. Notably Barbara Solo, who says that really what happens in Ireland is a failed bourgeois revolution in land, where you get this archaic backward land structure because of a failed transition. or Paul Bew, who when he wrote about the land question in the 1970s, was explicitly writing from a Marxist perspective. He retains his analysis of the land question, though having since become an advisor during the Good Friday Agreement to the Ulster Unionist Party, and having entered the House of Lords as one of the great and the good, where he is a crossbencher, difficult situation precisely, but it's somewhere to the right of the Labour Party, somewhat to the left of the centre of the old Conservative Party. This presentation was basically doesn't see the pre-famine peasantry as being a kind of proletariat, but rather one which is sharply divided between proletarian agricultural workers and tenant farmers. And that's where the class struggle exists pre-famine. It's not peasants against landlords, it's landholding peasants bashing down against those below them, the agricultural labourers. The argument is the famine wipes out the agricultural labourers. So you have a new phase where you have a peasantry which is now structured between the smallholders and the large graziers, farmers of maybe 200 acres, you're a powerful agricultural bourgeoisie. They go into a kind of tactical alliance against the landlords, but really it's an alliance which is dominated by the large graziers. And so, if you like, the small-holding peasantry are conned by the large graziers, and the victory goes to the the landholding peasantry are conned, and the victory goes to the large graziers. This, I think, is a kind of quasi or pseudo-Marxism, mostly driven, on the one hand, by a modernist contempt for the peasantry as such, which admittedly such contempt is not absent from most descriptions of Marxism, but is characteristic of modern bourgeois thought. I think that's the main driver of it. It's also characteristic of an opposition to history from below, which is very characteristic of Irish historiography, for various reasons. One, because the below in question is the peasantry, which is seen to be archaic and backward, and much against this drive towards the Celtic tiger. Two, because a subversion from below doesn't ring very well during the 35 years of the Troubles, where it becomes itself difficult. So the tendency of historians was to explode history from below, to show the pointlessness of popular struggle, to show the on-rolling victory, if you like, of the bourgeoisie. What is required is a modernization of this bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie throwing off any illusions it may have about being dragged down by popular sentiments, and instead there should be a blossoming of bourgeois Ireland in the form of the Celtic tiger. Now, insofar as I think my book is kind of Marxist, but it takes a rather different perspective from all of this. One which is, I'm sure some people will feel indulgent to the peasantry in comparison. Historians have often assumed that peasants are introverted, conservative, apolitical, and pre-modern. Now, I think this is misleading in many important respects, and certainly misleading for Ireland. The peasantry in Ireland was, first of all, we have to understand it as, in many respects, a self-sufficient social formation made up not just of agriculturalists, not just of direct farmers, but of agriculturalists and craftspeople, of village artisans. Any peasantry is about 3/4 farmers, 1/4 a craft, and that holds for Ireland with varying proportions over time. And Ireland has got particularly a particularly precocious and long-standing tradition of a rural-based popular movements, which are revolutionary or quasi-revolutionary or subversive, and always outside the law to one degree or another. These movements have got numerous names. There's lots and lots of names of different organizations, which are either taken by themselves or applied by others. going over many, many decades. I've used the term because I think it's a term which is used generically at the time, of the boys, or the Buachally, which is simply Irish for the boys. Part of the reason I went for that term, the boys, Buachally, is because when I was growing up, and more than growing up, when I was a young adult in Northern Ireland, the boys was still a term used popularly to refer to the paramilitaries. What were the boys doing last night? They blew something up, you know. So it's a long-standing tradition, I think, to use this appellation for popular movements from below. So I've used them as a generic term for a multiplicity of peasant movements which involve people we might imagine now as peasants, being small farmers, but also including agricultural labourers, also very often including the village carpenter, the village blacksmith, the village shopkeeper, the village pub keeper, and indeed the traveller, the seller of songs, and so on. Now, an argument I'd make is that Ireland is radically different from England in an important way, a way which is important for English history. And I do have a kind of sidelight on the book, which I'll not go into great detail now, but it basically argues that the fundamental bourgeois class in the English countryside is not like the lower gentry or something like that. It's the yeomanry. It is basically a class which differentiates out over time from the peasantry, and becomes an agricultural bourgeois class, which in turn becomes a manufacturing bourgeois class, which in turn becomes an industrial bourgeois class. It's become fashionable over the last few years, and you can see it in Neil Davidson and so on, to look at the English Civil War as being a bourgeois revolution without a bourgeoisie. One thing I think I've made an argument for doing is putting the bourgeoisie back into the English bourgeois revolution, just to say it's not the merchants and it's not the gentry, it is the yeomanry, who actually are the revolutionary class in my view, and indeed are the revolutionary class in the pretty literal sense that they are the cadre of the new model army. They are actually the people who win by force of arms the English bourgeois revolution. The point being is what we have evolved by the time we get to certainly the early 19th century, well before that really, is a particular tripart structure in the English countryside. And indeed, if you look at Ricardo begins by describing capitalism in England, but the capitalism he describes is fundamentally an agricultural capitalism. He begins by saying you have landlords, and what the landlords do is provide fixed capital. That is, they rent out farms, which not just involving land, but also it's fenced and it's drained, and it includes farmhouses, it includes a farmyard, it includes everything you need. It's like a mini agricultural factory ready to roll. Then the yeoman farmer, the tenant farmer, provides the working capital as an investment. They rent out the fixed capital in the form of the farm. They use their own money as to provide, seed and cows and to pay for wage labour. So they provide the whatever the term is, the running capital, and then they hire in turn a wage labour to actually work the farm. So English agriculture is specifically capitalist in a tripartite sense. The Trinity formula that Marx will talk about is exactly all about this. Irish agriculture is radically different. The biggest difference between English and Irish agriculture is that the landlord in Ireland does not provide any fixed capital, does not provide a farmhouse, does not provide a farmyard, does not provide fencing, does not provide anything except for the bare land. And you don't have yeoman farmers. You don't have farmers who are managing a farm and working it through wage labour. What you have instead is a small holding peasantry who operate the farm primarily through family labour And as I may get time to say a bit later on, they operated also through cooperative labour with neighbours, known as Maethal. So you get a completely different structure of the peasantry in Ireland compared to England. An awful lot of what the kind of the historians I talked about at the outset, what they have tried to do is to apply the tripartite model to Irish agriculture, where it doesn't work. My fundamental argument is that Ireland is a social binary. On the one hand, you have the peasantry, which includes the labourers, the courtiers, very smallholders, the small tenants, and the craftsmen. That's the peasantry. And they are set against the landlords and their allies. So the great proprietors, but also the middlemen, the graziers, the ranchers, and so on. That's the divide. It's a binary between the broad-based peasantry on the one hand, the landlord proprietors and their allies on the other. English society, by contrast, is a tripartite structure of landowner, yeoman, labourer. The English conquest tries to implant the system they're developing in Ireland, but they fail. Let me check the time. Yeah, okay. So over a very long period, since the Tudor conquest, which is where my book begins, there's a concerted English attempt at the conquest of Ireland. In the 16th century, early 16th century, English control is really, really limited to Dublin and not much beyond that. So we see a prolonged period of conquest going over a very long time, which is commonly parted out in some respects. The conquest is the social revolution, and that still stands. I mean, we can caveat certain things of what James Connolly argued in Labour and Irish history, but the central point kind of remains, which is the English conquest is a social revolution, overthrowing a particular mode of a Gaelic mode of production, and trying to impose upon it this kind of English tripartite mode of agricultural production, of landlord, yeoman, and agricultural labourer. Importantly, it doesn't work. Doubly importantly, part of the conquest, it doesn't work in so doing, but doubly important, part of the conquest is not just imposing a social structure, but imposing by direct colonization, colonies of the tripartite social structure on Irish territory. And the way that one identifies and maintains the coherence of these colonies is by making sure they're Protestant, whilst the natives of Ireland, as they're known, are Catholic. So we have a very prolonged period of colonization in the literal sense of planting people, which goes well into the 18th century. By the time you get to the 18th century, the aim is to encourage work colonies of Protestant linen workers, the hope being that they can be planted across Ireland. Their population of these small Protestant colonies will expand more rapidly than the Catholic population around them, and eventually the religious and social composition of Ireland will be transformed. Catholic regions are steered towards low population density pastoral agriculture, a linen manufacturer which requires high population density. Every attempt is made to limit them to the Protestant work colonies. Now, because of the conquest, the Irish peasantry as such have really no long-standing rights. So you don't have a stratified Protestant, or you don't have a stratified peasant population in Ireland the way you have in most of Europe. Most of Europe, you see a peasantry which is stratified by innumerable different levels of rights and privileges, which have descended through decades and centuries of the evolution of land tenure. In Ireland, you don't, because simply the conquest means you have, on the one hand, proprietors, on the other hand, the peasantry. So you have a unusually unified Irish peasantry, not divided by inherited social stratification, feudal stratification. On the other hand, you have a deeply divided Irish peasantry, of course, that which takes the form of a division between Catholic and Protestant, settler and native. Now, in the 18th century, you can see some pictures going on here. We have the rise of agrarian militancy. I say agrarian militancy with some caution because I think there's a temptation by historians to be too inclined to have apolitical agrarianism on the one hand and political quasi-nationalism on the other, and to have a big, deep divide between them. And I think that's basically wrong. So I occasionally use the term agrarianism in my book, but I'm a bit cautious about it. My preference is boyism, the Burgerly. My preference is a depiction of a popular bottom-up peasant assertion. And we can begin to see this early in the 18th century with the hawkers. And then the white boys, there's a little picture of the white boys there. The other picture is the rank and file of the United Irishmen, which is basically depicted in this hostile cartoon as basically being a direct continuation from the agrarian militants of the white boys. I think that's largely right. I think the rank and file of the United Irishmen, and even beyond the rank and file, I think the rank and file and most of the officer level of the United Irishmen is fundamentally a peasant movement with a rather thin bourgeois a leadership structure which struggles to impose any much leadership. I think in many respects, the agrarian militancy, if we call it that, of the peasantry in the 18th century is actually political at the core, because it is a struggle against state-oriented, state-managed social engineering. It's a struggle to expand tillage against pasturage mostly in Catholic-dominated areas, when the interest of the state for a long time is to shrink down tillage because it's labour-intensive, and to expand pasturage because it's non-labour-intensive, because the aim of the state is to depopulate Catholic areas and to encourage high population density Protestant linen work colonies. Throughout the 18th century, however, there is a shift, an inexorable shift towards tillage, for various reasons I'm not going to now, and indeed the massive expansion of the potato. Potato is a very significant crop, mostly because you can live off it very healthily. So long as you've got milk or buttermilk, you'll be pretty healthy. So you can have a kind of monoculture subsistence economy, which actually leads to being quite well fed, quite healthy, and that is the case for the Irish peasantry. So the struggle of the Irish peasantry centres on defending tillage from the expansion of grazing. It's pushing on an open door because, in fact, various other economic and political tendencies are tending towards tillage too. And you have the evolution of a particular form of peasant economy, which is based on a labour exchange amongst peasants. And is based upon a kind of mutual insurance, the distribution of the potato surplus, which is always pretty considerable, between families, either to reward labour exchange or to act as a kind of welfare for those who have fallen at hard times. So we have a peasant economy which is not based very much upon a coin, but is instead based upon what you might call labour coin, the exchange of labour. And the exchange of labour being mediated through the exchange of the potato surplus, which virtually every peasant family has at one time or another. Now, peasant militancy can be very, very considerable, and Ireland comes, of course, much closer to Republican revolution than England does, and indeed most of Europe does in the 1790s, though the 1798 rebellion, which is primarily a peasant rebellion, is defeated. After 1798, I think Catholic peasants largely withdraw from middle-class alliances. The United Irishmen alliance had been a kind of one which is the peasantry allying with the middle classes, and after 1798 and the defeat of that, they rather think this is a bad idea. for a period. Also, United Irishmen had been an alliance between the Catholic peasantry and the Presbyterian, in particular, a bourgeoisie in Belfast, and to a degree the Presbyterian tenant farmers of Antrim and Down, if not of Armagh. This breaks down in the aftermath of 1798. For various reasons, the Presbyterian tenant farming class of Ulster, who had been in the vanguard of Republican revolutionism in the 1790s, turned conservative, increasingly aligned with Anglican loyalism via the Orange Order, become increasingly sectarian. And so there's a dynamic towards a conservatism, even ultra-conservatism, amongst the Ulster Protestant peasantry in the 19th century, a dynamic which, to no considerable degree, has ever been reversed. The decades after of the early 19th century do see a growing sectarianism, a polarization between Catholic and Protestant. Sees a very considerable peasant rebellion in kind of the southeast of Ireland, in Munster. The Rockite rebellion of the rising of the 1820s, which is both socially radical, politically quite radical, and deeply sectarian. So sectarianism has been was never absent from the question in Ireland, but it becomes a larger feature. Perhaps more significantly, though, is the coming together of the Irish peasant movement and mass constitutional politics, and led by Daniel O'Connell. I've indicated this before, but I think in this period it's worth bearing in mind the potato economy, if you like. The potato economy, first of all, ensured food security for almost all peasants. Virtually nobody starved in the decades before the famine. You do still read in the literature, because it's mentioned in the 1851 census, a series of famines, but I think these are basically mythical. I could go into more about that, but I think they're basically mythical. There's no strong sense of food insecurity outside very, very local crises in Irish peasant society in the decades before the famine. There are disease outbreaks, there are times of hardship for sure, and these are probably increasing in the decades before the famine. But it's not a population of starving people. It was an economy where cash was very scarce, but as I've already indicated, that fundamentally you have a labour exchange system based upon cooperation, mutual, and a kind of community welfare, which is lubricated by an economy of potatoes, of which is almost always a surplus wherever you look. It meant you have a particular kind of peasant culture, peasant economy based upon reciprocation and based upon reputation. This in turn gives rise to, I think, a kind of peasant culture of emotional expressive,ness and indeed wit. Also a tendency to curse, that is to this is an economy where being in the favour of your neighbours is kind of important, and casting people out of community is an exceptionally powerful damning weapon. In that sense, therefore, I think a lot of the writing about the Irish peasantry is not, as is often presented, simply colonial stereotyping from above, but rather functional social psychologies in an economy of reciprocation. Social unity prevails amongst the peasantry. I think the model presented by many historians of a peasantry which is deeply divided between small farmers on the one hand and agricultural labourers on the other, I think is fundamentally not recognisable. If you look at detail at the Irish peasantry before this time, the centre of the peasantry is the smallholder. Most smallholders will do a little bit of wage labour, though I'd say that in inverted commas. They do reciprocal labour, and that's basically how the economy works at that level. So social unity prevails amongst the peasantry. The key conflict remains, therefore, peasant versus landlord, not tenant versus labourer. And it's a period of a great deal of militancy. So over the Catholic emancipation struggle, a struggle fundamentally for Catholic civil rights, reaches some kind of achievement by 1829. To a large degree, this is a peasant movement. The Tithe War of the 1880s is an extremely and quite often violent movement of civil disobedience, rejecting tithes, which is a tax in support of the minority landlord-dominated Church of Ireland, which is the Anglican Church in Ireland, very much a minority elite church. There's a great deal of concern amongst the elites that we have a rest of barely controlled peasantry, which is kind of immune to economic reform and rationalisation from a landlord point of view. The landlords are just really not in control of this peasantry, which is, as you can see from this picture on Claddagh, which is the outskirts of Galway, a kind of an economy, a society of mutual support and reciprocation, which is hostile to the landlord class and not very much under landlord class control, except in the sense that the landlord class is able to seize a rent surplus. Now, the weapon the landlords use to seize the rent is, of course, the weapon of eviction. But this is difficult. They like to clear people off the land. They'd like to move towards pasturage, but it's extremely difficult to get people off the land because people who take over an evicted farm are liable to retaliation from the peasant Buchalí, the peasant agrarian leagues, who, if somebody comes in a kind of scab way to take over an affected farm, is liable to find themselves being burnt out or worse. So the landlord's in a difficult situation of overcoming peasant militancy. It's in this context that the Poor Law is introduced in 1838. Just checking the time. The Poor Law is introduced in 1838. The Poor Law, in essence, is designed to take families who have been evicted and to take them away from a locality by putting them in a workhouse. Or if they don't want to go into a workhouse, they can emigrate. But the logic of the Poor Law system is to break up the solidarity of the peasantry. The logic of the Poor Law system is to make it easier to evict by taking the evicted families out of the picture altogether, rather than have them hanging around in a locality, swearing vengeance against the scabs who've taken over the farm and encouraging a retaliation from the boys. So the Poor Law is not primarily or not importantly about welfare. In fact, you have an informal welfare system which works very well in Ireland. The Poor Law system is designed to break the unity of the peasantry and to increase the power of the landlords. And the architects of the Poor Law system, as it applies to Ireland, are very conscious, very clear about this. And I can quote a lot later on if people are interested. Now, the Poor Law system would have had its effect, I think. But the effect is massively accelerated by the impact, of course, of the Great Famine. A Great Famine is one of these things which the right is obsessed with. Suzanne Moore, who kind of used to be kind of on the liberal left, I suppose, some time ago, but has since kind of veered over to the increasingly hard right wing over the whole trans issue. And so she's got an article now about how the BBC is pro-trans or something, some kind of rant like that. But what's interesting about it, she has a section in it where she talks disparagingly about those who don't recognise the complicated reality of the Irish famine. Of course, this is right-wing code for those who criticise the landlords and criticise the state for what happened during the Irish famine, instead of realising that it's all very complicated and there's nothing you can do about the potato blight. I think, if anything, almost all accounts of the famine let the landlords off far too easily and let the state off far too easily. It's a nationalist cliche that during the famine, food was exported from Ireland to England. It's a nationalist cliche, which is a cliche because it's correct. There's only 1 year where more food was exported from Britain to Ireland than the other way around during the famine, and that one year was 1847, mostly because of a collapse of Irish agricultural production. A relief which comes to about 7 million mostly took the form of loans, which Ireland in the future paid back in multiples because England deliberately raised the level of taxation in Ireland in order to pay back the loans from the famine period. So wherever England paid out during the famine, it got back much more in the years to follow when Ireland was, relatively speaking, overtaxed, and that was very consciously done. During the period, agricultural production went down. Historians, therefore, have noted that the level of rents went down. What, as far as I can tell, nobody has noted until this book is that the proportionate level, the level of agriculture, the proportion of agricultural production seized in rent actually went up during the famine, from about 28% of all agricultural production being taken by the landlords. Over the years of the famine, that goes from 28% to 34%. In the same period, the absolute level of taxation taken from Ireland actually goes up. That's absolute level of taxation, never mind proportion to what's being produced. By broad reckoning, I think during the famine, seized by the landlords or the state, about half of agricultural production is taken out of Ireland. This is considerably more than is taken out of Ukraine during the collectivization famine, considerably more than taken out of the famine-struck areas in China during the Great Leap Forward. This is also a famine of extermination. I was kind of cautious about using that term, but I did in the end, partly because extermination at this time, and indeed as far as I can tell, at least into the 1920s, extermination means forcible removal regardless of life. It doesn't actually mean deliberate killing. It's forcible removal regardless of life is what extermination means. And people used the language all the time during the famine and the years following the famine in the period of mass eviction, a huge level of eviction. They call it the War of Extermination. And I think Frederick Engels was going to write a history of Ireland. He never gets beyond a draft of the first half of the first chapter, but he does have a list of chapter headings, and the appropriate title for this period in his book would have been The Years of Extermination. So I've stolen the title and used that for my relevant chapter. So an awful lot of people die, about 1 million people. Awful lot more people are evicted, or one way or another forced off the land and forced out. One estimate is about 300,000 households are cleared. The policy, which is quite consciously stated, is to anglicize the social structure of Ireland, to replace the landlord peasantry binary with an English-style trinity of improving landlords, preferably new landlords brought in from England, of improving yeoman tenant farmers, preferably English or Scottish or Welsh yeoman farmers brought in from Britain. And they're very clear that's what they want to see happen. And what's left of the Irish peasantry turned into an agricultural labouring class. And, you know, that is what people, the elites, the government, wish to see happen during and coming out of the famine. So I've referred to the policy at the time, and you know, anybody knows history of Russia will hear the resonance. The policy is to achieve the liquidation of the Irish peasantry as a class. Now, it doesn't work. It's a very high cost for something which doesn't work, but it doesn't work. Small holding peasantry comes out of the famine the other end. The average farm gets somewhat larger because there's less people on the land. But this doesn't actually mean a peasantry which has got substantially richer. First of all, there's been a shift from tillage to pasture. So to be a small farmer, you just need more land in order to have the same equivalent output if you've moved to pasture. Secondly, people are still using potatoes, but you have to remember that the blight is endemic. So the average productivity of the potato permanently goes down, at least until about the 1890s in Ireland, after the introduction of the potato blight. So the average farm before the famine is about 7 acres. After the famine, it's about 30 acres. But functionally, actually, that's about the same size, given the change of conditions. We are still talking about a peasantry of smallholders before and after the famine. I'm just quickly looking for a statistic. I can't find it just now, but yes, it's structurally the same. So what does happen after the famine? Well, the peasantry survives. Emigration replaces subdivision of the land, but still the farms are smallholders. They're larger than they had been, but the economy has changed, which just means the smallholder of equivalent function is somewhat larger now. And boyism does not disappear. It's often said that rural militancy kind of disappears. The end of outrage, as one book calls it. I don't think this is true. If we look at revolutionary Fenianism, there's a clear overlap with boyism. And most importantly, the land war of 1879 to 81 is, in effect, a peasant revolution against landlordism in Ireland. The historians have tended to depict the land war as being a temporary alliance between the smallholding tenants and the large graziers. And in the end, the outcome is a kind of victory for the large graziers who take over from the landlord class. I think this is just wrong, actually. I mean, I think the graziers are not a part of the Land League coalition. The Land League coalition is fundamentally based upon the smallholding peasantry and indeed the agricultural labourers. The graziers, the very large, clearly capitalist-orientated petty landowners, as they're considered, are not part of the Land League coalition in any important sense. In fact, the achievement of the land war, the 1881 Land Act and an amending act, which comes with that, both these acts, which are struggled for by the Land League, explicitly exclude from their provisions the graziers. They exclude any farm which is worth £50 or more a year. That is, it excludes the graziers. So the Land League struggle is a peasant revolution, and a peasant revolution which is largely successful, which is substantially successful in its own terms. The Land Act of 1881 fundamentally curtails landlord power, and indeed is the beginning of landlordism as such in Ireland. Let's take a drink here. It's driven by radicalism from below. This is a picture, by the way, of some peasants who are going to seize meal from a meal cart during the famine. So the disaster of the famine, at least, was met with some resistance. These are agrarian militants during the Irish Land War of 1879 to 81, known as moonlighters. This is a satirical picture from a little booklet made in Germany, so the Germans must have been interested. But anyway, here they are making their own bullets. This is literally true. This is what they did do, they make their own bullets. I'm sure they also acquired bullets, but this was a kind of self-starting movement. But it's not lump and criminal one. This is an interesting picture from a French newspaper showing a peasant family discussing the new agrarian law, that is, discussing the 1881 Land Act to consider whether they should accept it, whether they should not accept it. What the 1881 Land Act does is basically put permanent downward pressure on the rent, and opens the door to the liquidation of not the peasantry, but the liquidation of the landlords as a class, ultimately by having the landlords bought out. The landlords are not bought out until the 1903 Wyndham Land Act, and then amended by another act in 1909. The main reason the landlords are not forced to sell out completely It's because for most of the last couple of decades of the 19th century, the value of land is declining year on year. Therefore, the peasants don't want to come to a deal with the landlords to buy the landlords out, because they know the value of their farms will have gone down the following year and the year after that and the year after that. So in fact, what they do instead is they just drive down the rents. It's only when the land values bottom out and begin to rise again that the Irish peasantry then move in for a deal where they buy out the Irish landlords. Basically, they buy out the landlords at the bottom of the market. And then as the market improves for the Irish peasantry, it's the Irish peasantry who benefit. So in my view, it's 1881, the land war of 1879 to 81 is virtually an unalloyed victory. It's a social revolution, and one which is successful. From that point of view, kind of worthwhile looking at from the point of view of how does one do a revolution. Various things one could say about that. I think what really gets the ball rolling, however, is the establishment, in essence, of a revolutionary coalition, a coalition between parliamentary radicals, and I mean radicals. The main representative is Charles Stewart Parnell, who these days historians tend to present as this complicated guy who's really a conservative. I think most of this is nonsense. I think Parnell is a straightforward radical in almost all important senses of the word. He's only a conservative in that he really hates the liberals. He's a conservative in the same sense that Karl Marx prefers the conservatives to the liberals in the 1880s. It doesn't actually, he's not a conservative in any other important sense. Parnell goes into alliance with the Fenians, who are ideological Republican separatist revolutionaries. The purists of the Fenians want nothing to do with the land war because it's a vulgar class question, but the rank and file are all up for it. And then the third element is the Burgerly, the long tradition of boyism, the long tradition of peasant militancy. This is the third leg to the revolutionary alliance of the Irish Land War, which in my view is virtually completely successful in what it seeks to do. And therefore reverses in the most radical way possible the verdict of the famine. So it's perhaps an unusual example of class struggle in history, where even within the horizon in which we live, I would say the outcome is rather nice. I'm kind of conscious I haven't explicitly addressed the question of my title, so I'll just do that thing that people say. It'll be better dealt with in the discussion which follows. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting. Well, what a book. So looking forward to that. The Rising of the Moon. Discussion is open. There you are. By the Rising of the Moon. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hands up, comrades, if you want to speak. There you go. There's no hands going on at the moment. Although there was some chat actually. So there's Anne, go ahead, please. Oh, it's silent, muted. There. I'm still muted.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have it. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, Mark, I did miss some of your talk because I was out at an event, but so I really like this exploration and like you reconsidering this period. And I like the title, of course, because of that old song at the rising of the moon. Wexford, I think, is a Wexford song. Anyway, so what really I just wanted to ask you to give a bit of detail on why you think the aims of the Land League were successful. Thanks.
Yeah, the potatoes in a sack, of course, is a Marx quote, isn't it? The peasants can't be a class because they're in the same sack, but potatoes stay separate. So there you are. But there you are, they're a class. Mark's talking about the classes in the countryside. So go on, who wants to come? No, quiet. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for that. It is very interesting. I started reading the book, but I'm not terribly far into it. I was struck by your characterization of the peasant economy as a cashless economy. And I think that I'm sort of, and also as an economy which involves a great deal of reciprocal collaboration and of the reciprocal collaboration and dependence and a reputational economy. And I think that that's actually English agriculture before the creation, the effective creation of the Trinity, I think also has characteristics of that sort. You can see it in the studies which people have done of peasant interpersonal credit, Muldrew, economy of obligation, is looking at it's somewhat more marketized, but equally Spafford money and its use in medieval Europe makes the point that the peasants only see the money um, uh, shortly after harvest time. They sell the crop for they go to town. They sell the crop for cash. They buy. They pay the rent. A lot of the money that they get back goes on paying the rent, and then they buy hardware. But everything else is done in cashless um, balancing of debts and accounts and so on within the village. And that seemed to me to be your description seemed to me to be less sharply different. And then on the other hand, in terms of the development of the yeoman farmer, I guess the difference is that in essence is that the um, landlord class, the Irish landlord class exports the money so that there isn't any tendency towards reinvestment or and indeed actually the continued downward pressure of rents on the tenant class has the consequence that you get this the binary that you're describing. Yeah, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. I'm talking bollocks. I'll leave it at that.
Bollocks. So, John, go ahead. Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I've got a couple of questions, but also a sort of a comment. You described the aim of the elite in London, Westminster, Dublin, to eliminate the peasantry as a class and establish big or biggish land lords, tenant capitalist farmers, rural proletariat. But other than the resistance, okay, that's other than the resistance, why didn't that succeed? So that's the sort of that's the question. Then this is just a sort of an aside comment. If you look at what Marx was talking about, this very much influenced, obviously, Marxists subsequently. So, you can read, I'm sure you have, Plekhanov, Are the Peasantry a Class? No. You can certainly read Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they have their formula, don't they? Sort of before the overthrow of Tsarism, we're in alliance with the whole of the peasantry against the Tsarist autocracy. But after the overthrow of Tsarism, then then we're in alliance only with part of the peasantry, and then we get into this debate between the middle peasants and the poor peasants, and we need to not lose the middle peasants and all the rest of it. I know I've said to you before, I'm no expert on the Russian peasantry, but I have looked at the question, and one of the sort of books that struck me was really Sholokov, not a historian, but a novelist, of the Cossacks. But what struck me in particular was his sort of description, precisely that what you've described is the solidarity of the peasantry. And although he describes very eloquently, because he's living under the conditions that he is, the conflict between the kulak, or the elite Cossacks and those below, and those that have had their education in the Red Army. Nevertheless, I do think that what you have is, in Orthodox Marxism, perhaps the peasantry is understudied. The peasantry is underappreciated in terms of the cohesion that it actually operates as. In other words, although you can have a conflict between the kulak and the poor peasantry, you've also got, it might be that the kulak is your uncle. In other words, he's actually also doing you favors. He's not just someone who's squeezing you for all he's worth. And also in that particular respect, I was going to comment on, again, very tangentially, sorry about this, in terms of the Soviet, I call it working class, but precisely with inverted commas. To what extent could the Soviet working class act as a class? I would have thought myself, that the studies are to a very little extent, because they didn't have freedom of speech, couldn't publish, couldn't organize. But I was just going to quote to you this famous phrase: better to have 100 friends than it is to have 100 rubles. And that's the sort of, you do me a favor, Blatt, you do me a favor, I'll do you a favor. It's not that, I saw a comment, it's not that potatoes operate as money, it's precisely favors. And that's what I'm just asking you to elaborate on in terms of the Irish peasant economy. It wasn't just about you owe me 100 potatoes. It's I'm going to do you a favor if your horse dies, or I'm going to do you a favor if your dad dies. I'm going to look after your kids, or I'm just asking for some sort of illustration. Excuse me, of that. I'll shut up.
Over to you, Mark. Is it? No hands. Not finishing, Mark. Not finishing. Just
No,
if you want to come in.
Dan, a number of people have just been promoted. Please wait.
Oh, we
if
got
I-
more speakers.
If I brought someone back, they
Yeah,
need
there's-
to raise their hand again.
Okay, I got Paul Damati ready to speak.
Yeah, I mean, just probably quickest to hit the button. But yes, I would just say I will recommend people buy the book, although I haven't finished it yet. So I'm just hoping it doesn't suddenly get terrible in the last 200 pages or something. But it's yeah, very, very interesting. Like a lot of the detail is fascinating. In the sense I remember my mother talking about being terrified of the banshee, in like 50s Waterford City, like a lot of that sort of the stuff you mentioned as part of the peasant psychology and sort of persisted. I guess I got one question, which is you mentioned in passing that about when you were talking about the fact that the Ulster kind of Protestant peasantry, but kind of the backbone of the kind of the United Irishmen, and how quickly they just switch into kind of the Orangeman kind of mode and become the sort of leading edge of reaction and remain so, as you say, like essentially to the present day. I'm wondering if you have any particular ideas about why that might have been like persisting even now, where like it doesn't strike me as it's terrifically advantageous to be a Protestant in Northern Ireland anymore necessarily. That like even at this point that we still seem to be kind of sort of stuck in that mold. Yeah, and also just it's a sort of scattered thought, but what does come out is that when we talk about peasantry, as you say, we're talking about a social formation, but then the thing with social formations is that they're always very specifically concrete, and as you say, the Irish peasantry doesn't look very much like the French peasantry, which is the famous potatoes in a sack of potatoes. Is about the French peasantry, right? It's 18th Brumaire. And I'm wondering if like is that the problem that maybe that we've had is sort of premature generalization, I guess, in Marxist theory of pre-capitalist class structures, and quite possibly in that sense, like that could affect the conceptualization of modern class structures, because capitalism in, I don't know, Sudan does not look that much like capitalism in America, or let's call China capitalist for the sake of argument. I don't know. So yes, I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on how we can not overgeneralize, but still make use of concepts like the peasantry as a sort of overarching theory of multiple different sort of specific social formations.
Yeah,
There
thanks,
are two
Paul.
people in the list, Noel Gregan and John Ryan. It's
Yeah.
up to Mark if he wants to come now, or you want to take these speakers before he comes.
What do you say, Mark?
Maybe taking another couple. Yeah.
Okay, Noel, go ahead, please.
Thank you. A couple of more series of questions than a contribution, Mark. Sorry, I was late tuning into you. I didn't know you were speaking. And I obviously missed from the bit I heard, very interesting. Now, what I'd like to deal with is I'd like to go back a little bit. The Ulster custom. Very much sorry, can people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You must have heard of Brendan Clifford as of the two nations theory, which he considers the key foundation of the new emerging class. I mean, challenged by my good friend Rainer Leistet, who said that Ulster industrialization was very much based on British capitalism. I know this is slightly off the point, but what I'm leading to is the famine in the northern part of Ireland on Tushkert wasn't as severe, and the phenomenon was very different there. I'd like your comments on that. I think that's a substantive point. I don't know if it's off the point of your main lecture. I was also very interested in Jack's comment that we didn't appreciate peasantry enough, because now, as someone from the Watchtower, what I notice incessantly is post-capitalist economies, how often the land question and the production of food emerges as a crisis. Ukraine in the 30s, Venezuela and Cuba, for instance, are often indicted for the primitiveness of their food production and things like that. I'll stop.
Well, thanks, Noel. Yeah, it's open discussion, Noel. There's no restriction on what you want to talk about. John, your turn. John Ryan.
Yeah, it just came to mind that Bernard Shaw had a few good one-liners kind of representing that period. One of the ones from the John Bull's Other Island was discussion, and the Englishman is explaining the Irishman, and he's saying that whatever you do, don't call him middle class. And obviously that was in the 19th century context where it was less prestige by being middle class anyway. But he said the Irishman anyway, he said he's either a gentleman or he's not. And he also then goes on to talk about the typical tenant farmer, and that he'd, drive himself into the ground, working, hard labor, pushing himself, working himself to the bone in the same way that a laborer would, except the fact that he had absolutely disdain for the laborer and disdain for the landless people. There was a strand of that. It might have been stronger in the late 19th century, perhaps. Other things that I was thinking of was that poor and all as they were, there was a great respect for education among the Catholic natives, if you want to call them that, and some of that went back to the olden times before that of the hedge schools and stuff, which was a thing hated by Daniel O'Connell. But anyway. That in the late 19th century, by the time the British eventually institutionalized national school education, it was a way to sort of try and impose a curriculum on these Irish, because the literacy was high, or at least demand for learning was high, and the Irish had so many nationalist newspapers were cropping up, and it was known that however official or unofficial, people were starting to be educated and be literate in terms of basic reading and writing. And I think there was a couple of waves that overlapped each other, in a sense that just at the very time when some tenant farmers were dragging themselves up, and you had this process of modernization. In the 1870s, you had Cardinal Cullen, who basically introduced modern Catholicism as is known by our generation and by our parents' and grandparents' generation. It wasn't something that was just there, but it was a very deliberate, the institutions of Rome wanting to also do the same as the British government, in league with the British government, actually, to try and imply that what the Irish would be reading or learning about would be, a sort of contentment with the higher orders, and to not be questioning things too much. So as regards the famine and the later period where the land war was, there was shifting sands as well, and there was the role of institutions, I think, was important. So that's just my observation.
Thank you, John. There's no hands up that I can see, unless anybody knows different. So, Mark, you don't have to wind up now, but you can reply to discussion if you like so far.
Thank you. Lots there, and I couldn't hope to cover it all. But some of the points, I think, what Mike is raising about the cashless peasant economy. Of course, it's not entirely cashless, because rent is cash. So everybody who's involved in agriculture, almost everybody's involved in agriculture, needs to get their hands on cash in order to pay the rent. So they're involved in that. They're not outside the circuits of, if you like, the larger capitalist economy in any regard. But nonetheless, and I use that term, I think Paul probably has reasonably raised an eyebrow, but I'm using the term social formation, because generally social formation in Marxist language means something else. I was just trying to use social formation to indicate that the peasantry is a ramified class. It's got layers in it, which includes non-agriculturalists. So it's probably a bit cheeky from a Marxist perspective to use that term, but I did so anyway. But we have a kind of a complex articulation within the peasant economy, in which it relates to the landlords through the cash nexus. but relates within itself a largely subsistent economy. I think they do relate to each other via labour coin. The potato does kind of act as a labour coin. The thing about labour coin is you can't really sell it for money usually because it's too difficult to transport to market. It's too bulky. It doesn't last that long. It lasts a good amount of time, but it'll be rotten after about 8 months, So what you use it for is welfare. And this is a peasant culture, which is will have beggars coming to the door and being fed potatoes at all peasant houses every night. That's just standard. And if you fall into that situation, then you can rely upon getting aid from your neighbours. And fundamentally, the landlords don't contribute anything importantly to welfare. It's all the peasantry, if you like, insuring themselves. But also it lubricates labour exchange. Simply young people in particular will turn up, collectively raise the barn or collectively bring in the crop, and they'll be feasted with potatoes, and this is part of the culture. It's an important political aspect of it too, because I think the Meathall work gang is also the basis for the Buachally. It's the basis for the peasant insurgent, organization within the locality. And indeed, at times, it's explicitly the basis for insurrection, as it is when Father John Murphy takes a collective labour crowd, people who turned up to take up his crop, and he mobilises them into insurrection in 1798. So money is there, but for the equivalence, it's not really wage labour, but the closest you get to wage labour, potatoes play that function. Lord Wellington actually kind of realised this years before the famine. He said that any failure of the potato crop would mean that labourers would see their wages disappear, so that even if the markets of Ireland were filled with food for sale, these unfortunate peasants could buy nothing as they have nothing. And that's literally the case. It's not that Ireland is poor in an absolute sense. I mean, it's one very striking thing is that during the famine, the Times estimates that Ireland is the biggest exporter of food in the world. In the world, it's the biggest exporter of food. Now, mostly to Britain, but nonetheless, by the 1920s, Ireland is the biggest exporter of livestock in the world. I think by the early 21st century, Ireland is the biggest exporter of Viagra in the world. So make of that what you will. When the potatoes disappear, labour coin disappears in Ireland. Its failure meant that the labourers of Ireland were as completely bereft of the means of existence, to quote this guy who wrote about it at the time, as the labourers of England would be if by any fatality their wages for a year were not forthcoming by their employers. So the first people to be hit by the famine are those who are entirely reliant upon getting potatoes in return for labour. Having said that, sometimes the famine's presented as being almost a victory for the small farmer, and so many really the agricultural labourers are swept away, and that's just not true. It's just not true. You have to be really, really quite a comfortable farmer before you come through the famine unscathed. The famine is a catastrophe for the peasantry at large. Lots of really interesting stuff from Jack about the Russian peasantry and so on. I think he knows more about the peasantry than I do. Some of these kind of conservative Marxists I mentioned at the outset, these historians like Paul Bew, will happily use the term kulak. I think kulak is pretty dodgy when applied to the Russian peasantry, and it's almost completely dodgy when it's applied to the Irish context. The larger tenant farmers are part of the peasantry. They're not in any real sense a kulak class. You might begin to talk about something which is like a kulak class when you're talking about the large graziers, but actually they're not really yeoman farmers. They're petty landlords, and they're understood as being petty landlords because that's what they are. And they are hated at least as much by the mass of the peasantry as the landlords are, and they are excluded from the land league in any meaningful sense. And so the idea of the land league has been a kind of coalition between the graziers and the peasantry and the graziers come out on top. I think it's just crazy. It's just a complete misreading of what happens. I don't think it just isn't the case. Jack asked a question, which is a good one, about why this great kind of British scheme to liquidate the peasantry and replace it with the tripartite structure of a capital providing landlords, yeoman capitalist farmers, and agricultural wage labourers, why that doesn't happen. It's partly because yeoman farmers don't travel to Ireland from Britain. They just don't come in any significant number. They'd rather stay where they are, or they'd rather go to the United States or Canada or something like that. Similarly, not much capital comes in from England. So in a way, the Irish peasantry did what was expected of them. That is, they died in large numbers and they emigrated in large numbers. There's the other guys who let the planners of state policy down by refusing to come into Ireland. There's also an element to, and Jack did says, as well as resistance, and resistance is actually overlooked quite a lot, but is significant. So, for example, 1850, this guy, Richard Molivera, the land agent, was assaulted and killed near Crossmaglen in County Armagh. Those with longer memories will remember Crossmaglen as a centre for militant resistance to lots of things in our own lifetimes. As a Gaelic scholar, local historian at the end of the 19th century, Thomas McGuilkin, wrote about this. And he said, the great reduction in rent that followed the putting away of the land agent, the agent for the landlords, Mulivera, did not go unnoticed by the tenants of other estates. Those that were somewhat dormant awakened. Ribbonism and agrarianism became more assertive. There was a general demand for similar reduction in other estates. Landlords and agents spoke in more subdued tones. In brief, the Ribbon men governed South Armagh, Monaghan, and North Louth for nearly 10 years. They smashed landlordism in the district. One thing I kind of want to get through with the book is that, the ruling classes don't always win, and that's not an unimportant thing for us to kind of get our heads around, I think, Paul is asking, to what extent does Marx underestimate? I think often Marx's comments about the peasantry are kind of misunderstood. It's often presented as if the peasantry don't have class consciousness. Marx actually talks about the peasantry having a property fanaticism. Whatever a fanaticism is, it's a consciousness, He's more talking about their agency. And he sees, modern revolutions being something which is concentrated on the urban nodes of power. To some extent, the urban nodes of power are not irrelevant in Ireland, but they're not super irrelevant, because frankly, the urban nodes of power in Ireland under the Union, those urban nodes of power are in England. They're not. It's not Dublin in essence. It's London. That's where a power resides. So in some respects, you can have movements in the capital and so on, and that may be of some significance. But really, the political action tends to happen in the countryside. The same, frankly, applies to the War of Independence, which is essentially a rural struggle. Historians seem to be anxious to deny that, but it's obviously the case. 1916 is an outlier. The War of Independence is fought in rural Munster primarily, and other rural areas. Fought and to a large extent won in those areas. So I think it's difficult to look at Ireland and not see the peasantry as the main actor, as a social force. It probably does require some kind of reconsideration of at least some of Marx's formulations. But there was a biography of him a few years back. I can't remember who did it now, but it was interesting. It did highlight actually just how interested Marx and Engels actually were in the peasantry at large. And they do make a statement at a certain time and say, when the German Revolution happens, it's going to need the peasantry, So I think they're a bit less dismissive of them than is often stated to be the case. I found, to my surprise, actually just reading in detail what Marx and Engels said about Ireland, just how good they are in the detail, really is very impressive what they are in the detail and what they are and what you might call the mid-range theory. Some very, very acute comments, which how acute they were kind of only became apparent to me the more I worked on it, and particularly what they say about the poor law system. What they don't have much to say about is the land war itself from 1879 to 81. I think Marx is just too old to be bothered with it, and Engels seems to have lost his earlier enthusiasm for all things Irish, you know. So they say a lot about the Fenians, but they don't say much at all about the land war, which I would hope they would have done, because there you really are talking about something which in my view is effectively a social revolution. Somebody asked why I thought the land war was a victory. I think fundamentally because it leads to a situation where the landlords lose control of the ability to evict and the ability to raise rents, and instead a process is put in place which puts continual downward pressure on rents. It doesn't destroy landlord power, it doesn't completely destroy the ability to evict, but it hobbles the landlord class. There's actually an interesting article Kautsky did at a certain point where he said, in that kind of Kautskian way, it's probably what the socialist revolution will be like. You'll have a phase where the bourgeoisie are so hobbled that they'll come to the point the bourgeoisie will just go, we give up, please socialize the means of production, because there's too much of a pain in our ass to run it anymore, because you know, we've lost all our advantages in the class struggle. I don't think that's terribly applicable to how socialist revolution might apply, but it's not entirely wrong about what happens in Ireland. And so the big question is, why does it take so long for landlordism to be liquidated? And as I say, I think the fundamental question is simply the Irish peasantry are canny. They're waiting for the price of a land to bottom out. And basically, as soon as it does, then the landlords are bought out by the British state at the lowest price which can possible. In the meantime, the peasantry have beaten down the levels of rent, and any appreciation in land values, which becomes quite sharp during the First World War, now goes to the peasantry. Will not go to the landlords, won't go into the landlord pockets. Now, it is true, it's still a compromise, because the 1881 Land Act does see the landlords compensated by the British state, and they basically take that compensation and piss it up the walls. You know, they don't do anything useful with it. It means the Irish peasantry is still paying back the British state at a level much below previous rent, but still they're paying them back something. This becomes an issue in the 1930s because the De Valera state refuses to hand those annuities, as they're called, back to Britain. This leads to economic wars, it's known, a tariff war between Britain and Ireland, which fundamentally ends an Irish victory, because Ireland owed Britain 100 million. They pay it off with 10 million, and they get the treaty ports back and all that kind of stuff, you know. The peasantry actually continue to pay the annuities, but they pay it directly to the Irish state, and the Irish state uses it to redistribute land. And that redistribution doesn't stop until the 1980s. So in many respects, I agree. Noel mentioned Rayner Isaacs, and I used his book at the end of my book, and he says what De Valera does is the consummation of the peasant revolution. And I think that's right, you know. And my general view of De Valera out Ireland is much less negative than most people have now, you know. It's interesting. There's a brief reference to it in a book by Arthur Rosenberg, who is a German communist and then ex-communist, but he remained on the left, but he wrote a book about socialism and democracy and stuff, you know. And he says Ireland is one place where you have a radical peasantry in alliance with a radical bourgeoisie and a radical urban constituency, and it kind of works in Ireland. And I think he's kind of right, actually, for De Valera's Ireland. But I know that's unfashionable now, but I think it's the case. Just head schools. Head schools are really cool, and worked very well. Literacy rates were pretty impressive in Ireland. Education is good in Ireland before the national schools were brought in. Engels thought very highly of head schools, and he was right. And it does reinforce. I remember something years ago, Paul DeMarty wrote in Weekly Worker, which I think is right, that it tends to be reactionaries who celebrate the idea of independent autonomous schools and all this kind of stuff, you know, and therefore the left automatically are in favor of national curriculums and statism and stuff, you know. But the left really does need to reclaim pedagogy from below. of a popular education. The head school tradition is one we should be, proud of in these islands, and we should think about quite seriously, because it worked very well without the state. I'll leave that there for now. I'm sure I missed things out. My apologies for anything I didn't cover.
That's fine, Mark. Thank you very much. Got Toby. Toby, come in, please. Unmute.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry. What I'm going to say is about peasants, but it's not about Ireland. It's following on from what Jack was saying, but I many years ago, I think in the mid-70s, when I was a undergraduate studying history, read a book by Theodore Shanin called The Awkward Class about the Russian peasantry. And the point he makes is that Lenin's stuff about differentiation was all rubbish, basically. That the peasants kept redistributing land amongst themselves in the peasant commune every, I don't know, 7 years, 10 years, whatever, on the basis of the number of children they had, so that the notion that the kulaks were something completely different from the middle peasants and the poor peasants and all that stuff, it doesn't actually stand up. And this obviously was why, when collectivization comes, instead of it being a war against the kulaks, it becomes a war against the peasantry as a whole. Look, earlier on, when under late Tsarism, there was an attempt to get the peasants to differentiate and get people to pull out of the peasant commune, the община. As soon as the peasants had the other peasants had a chance, those who'd left got their land taken away and they got pushed back in. Was Stolypin, I think, wager on the sturdy and the strong or something. But it didn't work when the Tsar, in the late Tsarism, they were trying to break up the peasant commune. So I think that we can criticize Lenin on this, and in a way, what Stalin does, though, is absolutely terrible. Is a consequence of incorrect theory about the peasants that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had before. And I know it's a hell of a long time since I read Theodore Shanin, but I do recommend that book in terms of what it says about the Russian peasants being an awkward class, right? Rather than this thing that's differentiating into the upper peasants, middle peasants, and poor peasants, which is what Lenin thought was happening. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks for that, Toby. And I've got Mike McNair.
Oh, bugger.
This is actually just a short response to Toby's point just now. There is a book by a man called Burbank, A Russian Peasants Go to Court, about peasantry in the township courts in the late Tsarist Empire. And the picture which you get from that, and I think also one which you get from more recent Western historiography using Russian archival sources on the run-up to the revolution, is that the extent to which there is differentiation among the peasantry is very variable, but essentially dependent on how close the area is to urban markets. That in areas which are close to urban markets, you get marketization, differentiation, and marketization going along with marketization, differentiation, and the reduction of because you've also got the other side of it, Chayanov arguing about the life cycle aspect that the peasant, the successful peasant, has a large farm, then he has larger workforce, he takes on more land on lease. As, however, the sons marry out or move out, the workforce declines and he takes on less land on lease. And then at an old age, he's leasing out himself, of which for that Chayanov model, we've got a lot of English medieval evidence. So it's a sort of, I wonder whether, again, Mark, the issue which that poses is, again, is the difference depending on how close your farmers are to urban concentrations and to that sort of phenomenon.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Any other hands? Oh, yes, Noel. Go ahead, Noel. Best to unmute. We can't hear you yet, Noel.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah. Sorry, if Mark has an opportunity, I wonder if he could respond to my early query about whether the famine had a very different outcome in the north of Ireland, and whether that gives any credence to the Clifford theory about the Ulster custom, the primitive accumulation of capital, the uneven development of capitalism. He did refer all right to my comment of my reference to Renar Lycett. Renar Lycett challenged that and said it was British capitalism which was responsible for northern industrialism. Slightly off the point. I think it is of interest, though, what he was leading on to is about the land war, the outcome, and then the Westminster government stepping in the early 20th century and institutioned a massive capital availability for the peasantry to buy out the lands. Following that, of course, this is something which is very under, in my limited knowledge, I'm not a historian, the Irish Land Commission, which in the post-treaty period was responsible for the distribution of land. Now, that seems to have something that worked quietly but effectively. There's still residues of large estates in Ireland. Residues, just again, I would have to say I don't know about the 6 counties, but and I never heard anything about what you call nepotism being strongly avoided, or political patronage being strongly avoided, and all that. Would have anticipated. I mean, Mark is dead right about the peasant is very class conscious. He's a land grabber. Read The Field, yeah, by John B. Keane, and you can find that stories of that throughout rural Ireland, you know, about land envy. And again, that's something the revisionists have dubbed the Independence War, as just something about that. The last thing I want to point about the Land Commission, there is apparently massive sources which are still under restriction in the 26 counties. It's very hard to get access, for historians to get access to that, where I believe in the north that problem doesn't arise at all. Where they are stored in the north, historians have access to them if they want to study the kind of the redistribution of the land to the peasantry. You know, I mean, how do you do it? A landlord has several thousand. Yeah. Related to that, of course, is the I think what emerged in the early 1900s was the land labourers. Now, I don't know if they were an outcome of the peasantry or not. Very interesting thing. The famous Labour TD of the 60s and 70s, Dunn was his name. He came out of that tradition. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Noel. Okay, no more hands up. No more hands up, Mark. It's up to you. And it's 20 to 7. It's probably time to wind up. I don't want to stop anybody, but yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, and sorry, no, I didn't come back specifically on the Ulster question, and indeed, as was Paul raised that too. I don't think it would be definitive about it, but perhaps suggest some negatives. Ulster custom probably isn't sufficient. If for nothing else, when we see the move, the shift right, a shift towards reaction, really, which is happening in the first half of the 19th century. It's actually at a time of prolonged crisis for the linen industry. So no doubt that was buffered somewhat by the Ulster custom. I think more importantly, again, there's deliberate privileging of orange tenants by the landlords because they want to hold on to these guys because they see them as a bulwark for their position. So there's a privileging for Orangism and a privileging for loyal tenants in general. But there's also a prolonged crisis for Ulster agriculture because of the crisis of cotton manufacture in the first decades of the 19th century. And it must be remembered that when you have when you're able to rely upon cotton, it means you end up with very, very, very small farms. And if the cotton kind of stops making money for you, you really are in a difficult situation. Sorry, not cotton, linen. So when linen goes bad for you, you're in a very difficult situation. Now, nonetheless, this is the period when you can see a swing to the right. So there's a privileging of tenants. Ulster custom is part of that. But this is not a period of buoyancy for the Ulster economy in most respects. Famous Belfast industrialisation doesn't really happen until the American Civil War, actually, because the American Civil War cuts off American cotton, which then makes Ulster linen again very, very valuable, and you get linen textiles developing in Belfast, and you get a big recovery of linen agricultural production. So the 1860s is probably the point when Ulster kind of begins to pull away sharply in terms of capitalist development, and to a large extent, it's something to do with Ulster custom, but there's a lot more to do, I think, with the American Civil War. So I don't really think the Clifford thing, where you can just land it all in the Ulster custom, has been sufficient. Is adequate. If for nothing else, the Ulster custom, at least formally, also applies to Catholic tenants where they are in Ulster, and it doesn't make them into Unionists. It doesn't make them into Orange men, certainly. So it's difficult to get away with the religious division has been an important aspect, the long-standing kind of sectarian division, which in turn has got a lot to do with the kind of dynamics of social engineering over centuries. Wyatt's longevity is a large, complicated topic, which I don't think I'll go into now. Noel mentioned the field. I mentioned the field myself, but more actually as an example of the kind of, to be honest, the slandering of the peasantry, which is very popular amongst urban audiences.
Okay.
The hero of the field at one point is there's a donkey which goes onto his land, so you react as one does if you're a peasant, which shoot it through the eyes with a shotgun, and then he goes home and beats his wife, and then he murders some bloke who wants a field, This kind of idea, this is what peasants are like, I think is very resonant in the 1960s when people are turning against this, but it's not accurate about what peasants were like. They did kill people. The people they killed would be somebody who was a land agent or a landlord, or perhaps most commonly somebody who'd taken over a farm, very often taken over the farm from a widow. You take over a farm from a widow with children who then get thrown on the roadside. You're not quite signing your death warrant, but you're going a long way towards that. That's why people got killed by the Berkeley. It's not because they didn't kill people over half a field, or not much. But you do see historians in the 1970s desperate to drag up stories like that where they can find them. But if you look at the large figures, they're not interfamilial disputes over half an acre. They are about eviction. They are about raising rents in order to evict. They are about dispossession. And being evicted can mean death, or something, or leaving the land. And this relates to a wider issue. I suppose, I agree with Toby, significance to Shannon's work about the Russian peasantry. But in some respects, what's problematic about that kind of work, Cherniev and Shannon and Marshall Salins and stuff like that, is they end up positing this radically distinct peasant psychology. You know, this tradition is not absent from Marxist tradition. You know, the bourgeoisie as personifications of capital, this kind of thing. You know, one thing I do at some length in my book is in some respects trying to adjust the famous the base superstructure model. And I'm saying actually there's three layers of the base superstructure model. There's human nature, there's economic base, there's ideological superstructure. And you bring that into the picture, you don't get simple reflection, which is clearly not workable, but you do get torsion, you do get complex effects. But I do kind of insist that there is something called human nature, which is very unfashionable in history now, unfashionable in the humanities. There is something called human nature. I think Marx had a sense of it, but not a clear sense. What Marx does, like a lot of people does, is say that you have animal nature, which is constant. Then you have human nature, which is a product of history. In fact, as humans, we are humans all the way down. You know, our crudest sexual instincts are as human as it is turning up at Communist Forum. You know, we're human all the way down and back to front and beginning to end. And I think we need to work this into historiography. One of the reasons why history is becoming less and less fashionable and interesting is because, for a lot of people, is because people find history doesn't say anything anymore, because history has now become a history of incommensurable cultures. How everything in the past is radically different and everybody thinks differently from everybody else. And you're being anachronistic if you think you can draw anything essential about what it is to be human in the world from the past. Literally, history has become a history of superficialities. And I think it's really problematic, you know. And I think we need to do something about that. Part of the problem with something like Shannon, I think, is he's partly part of this idea where he's kind of suggesting, like in all these people, there's a radically distinct peasant psychology, which is different from the bourgeois psychology, you know. And I think that's wrong, you know. There's human psychologies and there's positions in the class structure which motivate you in various directions, but the psychologies are the same. There's actually an edited collection that Shannon did. Let's see if I can find the bit. Sorry, give me a second. I can find a quote from the book. So it's an edited collection of the 1970s, and everybody's talking about, you know, that the peasantry think different. They don't think like economic man, you know. But this one author, Suti Oritz, she said at the same time, she says, you know, peasants are often described as irrational, lacking in motivation, unable to delay gratification in pursuit of primarily social goals, and pessimistic about the opportunities available to them. And then she said, you know, economic theory is based on the assumption that Western businessmen and Western farmers act eminently rationally when planning their economic activities. But economists are well aware that the reality is different. Moral values, social goals, so on. The bourgeoisie, she effectively says, are well known for maximizing satisfaction instead of profit. The point she is trying to make, the point I'd make, is that you get place in social structure which motivates you and bends you to behave in certain ways, but you shouldn't run to the idea that you have fundamentally different psychologies, you know. The peasantry wanted to leave something to their children, like the bourgeoisie do. You know, there's nothing more of an obsession to the bourgeoisie than inheritance tax, you know. The peasantry wanted to make money when they could. And frankly, they wanted to hide money when the rent payer came along. Everything they did was eminently rationally, economically rational, same as anybody else, you know. So I kind of, whilst I agree with Toby that probably Lenin isn't quite right about the Russian peasantry, at a deeper level, I have a problem with people like Shannon and the way they kind of suggest a radically distinct social psychology of the peasantry. I think that's a real problem. And I think we need to start working again with the idea of human nature. in history and indeed in Marxism. That leads to all its own problems, I suppose, but it's still worth doing. Anything else came up? That might be nearly everything. Mike coming up with the urban concentrations point. I think it's probably something to that. There was a famous, funnily enough, there was a history paid for by the Guinness family to do the history of Guinness in Ireland back in the 1960s, I think. And the guys who did it did a really good job, and they actually just did a history of the Irish economy with a little bit of Guinness there, you know. And they came up with the famous theory of the dual economy, which is a eastern seaboard is kind of urban capitalist, western seaboard is non-urban, non-capitalist. But it doesn't really hold up. Good as their work was, it doesn't hold up because basically everywhere in Ireland exports, everybody pays rent in cash, and everybody, including quite substantial farmers, do labor exchange, you know. So you're going to have a certain effect. Most people are reasonably close at least to a county town. You may be in the west of Ireland, quite far away from Dublin. On the other hand, you've got 6 or 7 close relatives who live in America and send you a letter back every month and send you cash back and tell you what's going on, you know. So I think it's actually quite difficult to draw a picture of radical distinction between the peasantry and the urban capitalist economy. Because Ireland's just too well integrated. I mean, Ireland, as they were saying, is the biggest exporter in the world up to the 1840s of food, biggest exporter of livestock to the 1920s. But where are they exporting to? They're exporting to Britain. In the end, Ireland is right beside the economic powerhouse of the globe. In that sense, it's quite, unless you kind of go down the Eugene Weber path, which I think is fundamentally based upon, you know, bourgeois sarcasms about the countryside, you end up with a somewhat unreal picture. I think we are talking about a peasantry which is conscious of the world in which they live and conscious of changing it. I might just leave it there.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. Well, we'll invite you again. I think it was really good. So now Mark speaks at Communist University, of course, next summer, presumably again, I expect. Next week, we'll have political report from the PCC. I don't know about any special other outside speaker next week, as far as I know. So there you are. And we'll be keeping up, of course, with the fascinating developments in your party. Will it happen or will it not? Okay. Okay, bye-bye.